Canada is known around the world as a strong and free country. Canadians are proud of their unique identity. We have inherited the oldest continuous constitutional tradition in the world. We're the only constitutional monarchy in North America. Our institutions uphold a commitment to peace, order, and good government, a key phrase in Canada's original constitutional document in 1867, the British North America Act. A belief in ordered liberty, enterprise, hard work, and fair play have enabled Canadians to build a prosperous society in a rugged environment, from our Atlantic shores to the Pacific Ocean and to the Arctic Circle. So much so that poets and songwriters have hailed Canada as the Great Dominion. When Europeans explored Canada, they found all regions occupied by native peoples they called Indians, because the first explorers thought that they had reached the East Indies. The native people lived off the land, some by hunting and gathering, others by raising crops. The arrival of European traders, missionaries, soldiers, and colonists changed the native way of life forever. Large numbers of Aboriginals died of European diseases to which they lacked immunity. However, Aboriginals and Europeans formed strong economic, religious, and military bonds in the first 200 years of coexistence, which laid the foundations of Canada.
Before Canada was called Canada, it was called Turtle Island by the native people who have lived here for thousands of years. There are different stories of why it is called Turtle Island, and they vary from tribe to tribe, but there are many things that stay the same in every story. This is the story that I remember. Before there was any land, there was a native legend named Wissahickik, who after a great flood which covered the earth headed out in a canoe with the animals to recreate the earth. He forgot to take a piece of dirt with him, so he asked the animals to dive into the ocean and go to the bottom to bring up a piece of dirt. He asked the beaver first to swim to the bottom of the ocean, but when the beaver came back up he was so exhausted and he didn't have any dirt. Next, he asked the otter, but the same thing happened to the otter as the beaver. Then the muskrat volunteered to try get a piece of earth at the bottom of the ocean. The muskrat was down in the water so long that Wissahickik and the other animals thought he would not survive, and when they pulled him back to the surface he was dead, but he did have a small piece of earth clutched into his small paws. The muskrat sacrificed himself for a piece of earth so that earth could start again. Then the turtle came forward and offered to bear the weight of the piece of earth on his back so that it could grow. Suddenly the wind blew from all four directions and a piece of earth grew on the turtle's back until it became a huge island that today we call North America. Turtle Island was home to Indigenous people for thousands of years. Before the Europeans arrived, we were living on the land which met all of our needs for resources and spiritual practices. There were 6 main geographical areas in Turtle Island. Woodland First Nations, who lived in dense boreal forest in the eastern part of the country. Iroquois First Nations, who inhabited the southernmost area, a fertile land suitable for planting corn, beans, and squash. Plains First Nations, who lived on the grasslands of the prairies. Plateau First Nations, whose geography ranged from semi-desert conditions in the south to high mountains and dense forests in the north. Pacific Coast First Nations, who had access to abundant salmon and shellfish and the gigantic red cedar for building huge houses. And the First Nations of the Mackenzie and Yukon River basins, whose harsh environment consisted of dark forests, barren lands, and swampy terrain known as muskeg. In 1610, the first Europe settler arrived on Turtle Island, and then they just kept coming. The natives welcomed the settlers and taught them their ways, how to fish, how to hunt, how to survive in the near land. It was looking all good until the natives realized the Europeans didn't want to share the land. They just wanted it.
Between 1534 and 1542, Jacques Cartier made 3 voyages across the Atlantic, claiming land for King Francis I of France. Cartier heard 2 captured guides speak the Iroquoian word Canada, meaning village. By the 1550s, the name of Canada began appearing on maps. By the 1830s, more and more settlers began to arrive in Canada, and they began to establish new lives. The Indigenous people who occupied the land were encouraged to relocate, where they would be removed from the more harmful aspects of colonial society, specifically alcohol and prostitution. and where they would adapt to the new colonial reality at a controlled pace. Small areas of land called reserves were set aside specifically for the use of Indigenous people. In 1867, the Queen and the British Parliament passed the British North American Act Agreement, which was the official beginning of Canada as a country. That's why we celebrate Canada Day on July the 1st. In 1867, Sir John Alexander Macdonald, a father of Confederation, became Canada's first Prime Minister.
As early as 1637, there were experimental settlements that were created so the Indigenous people would adopt Christianity. This was the beginning of reserves in Canada. As more and more settlers arrived, they needed more and more land. Colonial authorities saw reserves as a way to stop conflict between Indigenous people and settlers. For thousands of years, we had our traditional lands which had been used for generations for hunting and fishing to support our families. As settlers began taking over the land with European farming practices, our way of life did not fit in this new economic system, and so they needed to find a way to set us aside. We were forced into small designated areas which were sometimes nowhere near our traditional lands and ceremonial sites, and a lot of times there were no resources which set us up for a future of poverty. These pieces of land were not owned by the Indigenous people. The government owned the land and controlled almost everything that happened on the reserves. In some of the areas of the country, Indigenous groups and the government started to sign treaty agreements to share the land and resources with settlers in exchange for the guarantee that traditional activities such as hunting and fishing would continue undisturbed and their practices respected. Not only they would be confined in a small area indefinitely.
From 1867 to 1914, the Canadian West opened for mass settlement and became home to millions of immigrant settlers seeking a new life. This immigration boom created key industries still important to Canada's international role, like agriculture, mining, and oil. The prairie provinces of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta grew rapidly in these years as settlers began to transform the barren prairie flatland and establish unique cultural settlements. Many motivations brought immigrants to Canada: greater economic opportunity and improved quality of life, an escape from oppression and persecution, and opportunities and adventures.
The government decided that the way to civilize Indians was to use farming as a tool. Even though we had lived on this land for thousands of years, Indian agents and farm instructors were to teach Indians how to farm using European practices. Many of the reserves had been located in areas where the land was unsuitable for farming, which made success almost impossible. Later, government agencies would use the low success rate as a reason to reduce the size of the reserves because we were not making good use of the area we had been forced to live in. Even though farming was almost impossible on many reserves, in Saskatchewan and a few other areas, some of the Indian farmers became even more successful than the settlers, and so this created a whole new problem, and quickly the government brought in a new policy to protect the settlers from losing their market share. In 1880, the government changed the Indian Act so that the First Nation farmer had to have a permit to sell cattle, grain, a load of hay, or produce, and they also needed a permit to buy groceries and clothes. This was called the permit system. To make sure that the permit system gave the advantage to the settlers, the policy also made it legal for the settlers to buy goods and services from First Nations farmers. This went on for 70 years, making it almost impossible for us to generate any income from our efforts or support our families until slowly after 1951, the government stopped enforcing this law.
When Canada took over the vast Northwest region from the Hudson's Bay Company in 1869, the 12,000 Métis of the Red River were not consulted. In response, Louis Riel led an armed uprising and seized Fort Garry, the territorial capital. Canada's future was in jeopardy. How could the Dominion reach from sea to sea if it could not control the interior? Ottawa sent soldiers to retake Fort Garry in 1870. Riel fled to the United States, and Canada established a new province, Manitoba. Riel was elected to Parliament but never took his seat. Later, as Métis and Indian rights were again threatened by westward settlement, a second rebellion in 1885 in present-day Saskatchewan led to Riel's trial and execution for high treason, a decision that was strongly opposed in Quebec. Riel is seen by many as a hero, a defender of Métis rights, and the father of Manitoba. After the first Métis uprising, Prime Minister MacDonald established the Northwest Mounted Police in 1873 to pacify the West and assist in negotiations with the Indians. This guaranteed the safety of prairie residents and attracted hard-working immigrants to the region. Today, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police are the national police force and one of Canada's best-known symbols. Some of Canada's most colorful heroes, such as Major General Sir Sam Steele, came from the ranks of the Mounties.
In 1873, Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, created the Northwest Mounted Police. He got the idea from a police force the British had created to keep the Irish under control. There was no coast-to-coast railway yet, and Canada had just purchased Western Canada from the Hudson's Bay Company, and the Prime Minister decided this police force would control the Indigenous people already living on the land. The job of the Mounties was to clear the prairies of Indigenous people and to move them onto reserves whether they are willing to go or not. History books, commissions, inquiries, and public apologies reveal what happened next. Indigenous people who resisted were starved onto reserves. Then in 1885, the government was worried that natives would leave their reserves to join together to resist and fight, so they made it so that Indians were forbidden to leave their reserves unless they had a signed piece of paper from a government Indian agent. This was called the pass system and was only going to be a temporary thing, but it ended up staying in effect until the 1940s. What it meant is that if an Indian wanted to leave their reserve for any reason, they would have to say where they are going and for how long, and it was up to the Indian agent if they were allowed to go or not. This pass system was also used to stop parents from going to see their children who were put into residential schools. In the 1950s, the government tried to destroy all evidence of the pass system which were stored in Battleford, Saskatchewan at Indian Affairs, but a few of the documents were saved to prove this system existed.
In 1883, Indian Affairs policy on First Nations education focused on residential schools as a primary vehicle for civilization and assimilation. Through these schools, First Nations children were to be educated in the same manner and on the same subjects as Canadian children: reading, writing, arithmetic, and English or French. At the same time, the schools would force children to abandon their traditional languages, dress, religion, and lifestyle. To accomplish these goals, a vast network of 132 residential schools was established across Canada by the Catholic, United, Anglican, and Presbyterian churches in partnership with the federal government. More than 150,000 Aboriginal children attended residential schools between 1857 and 1996.
In around 1883, the federal government formalized the residential school system. This system had actually been around since the mid-1600s when church-run schools, specifically for Indigenous children, were built in eastern Canada. But when they wanted to focus on the expansion of Canada, the government stepped up its plans to get rid of the Indian problem and help settlers claim land occupied by the Indigenous people, so they decided to fund and expand the schools. It was decided that this was the best way to get rid of the Indian question altogether. In order to make that happen, they decided that if they forcibly took children from their families and took away every aspect of who they are as human beings, if their traditional knowledge was erased, their identities obscured, and their voices silenced, they could take the Indian out of the child, and their problem would be solved. There would be no more Indians. Government Indian agents and officials from a variety of government departments were assigned to develop and maintain these schools. They would be federally funded, church-run industrial boarding schools and would be one of the many tools used as part of a broad, aggressive assimilation plan. The RCMP were dispatched and in charge of removing children from their homes and enforcing punishment on any parents who tried to stop them. Children as young as 4 years old were taken and siblings were separated from each other. When children arrived at the school, they were given steaming hot baths and rough brushes were used to scrub their skin raw because they were dirty savages. They had their hair cut and were made to wear European clothing, removing all visual aspects of their culture. They were forbidden to speak their language and were punished if they spoke anything other than English. They did not get the same education as the public system. Most time was spent doing unpaid labor which the schools relied on to run. Girls were taught to sew, cook, do laundry, and clean. Boys were taught carpentry, tinsmithing, and farming. And because they had so little time for school, most students only reached grade 5. By the time they were 18, they were sent away. More than 40% of the teaching staff were not actual teachers. Fort Albany Residential School in Ontario, also known as St. Anne's, was one example of the worst of the abuse to Indigenous children in Canada. It opened in 1906, and if it had not been for the persistence of the survivors of that school who began to tell their stories of excessive physical and sexual abuse publicly in 1992, the information about what happened would have disappeared. The government of Ontario then started a 5-year investigation, and the documents were released in 2014 that reveal stories of the children being locked in the basements for days, forced to wear soiled underwear on their heads for hours, forced to eat their own vomit, beaten with metal whips, and even being strapped to a homemade electric chair in front of other children while staff watched. There were stories of horrific sexual abuse to children of all ages by priests, nuns, and other staff at the school. Residential school survivors from across the country have stories of physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, starvation, being part of malnutrition experiments, neglect, racism, and loneliness. These children did not know the love of parents, family, or their community, and were deprived of emotional caring or connection. One of the darkest elements of the residential school system was how many children died or just disappeared while attending. Between the abuse, poor sanitation, overcrowding, and severely inadequate food and health care, the government medical inspector Peter Bryce reported in 1907 that 24% of previously healthy Aboriginal children across Canada were dying in the schools. He also reported that this did not include the 47% to 75% children who died at home, where they were frequently sent when they were seriously ill. After reporting these facts, the government took away Peter Bryce's position and hid the facts from Canadians. Often it would take months for families to learn that their children had died while at the school. Many families never heard what happened to their children and still wait for answers to this day because they just didn't bother keeping track of the children who died. Said Senator Murray Sinclair, who was the former chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was standard practice to include a cemetery alongside schools when they were built so they would have a place to bury the children who did not survive. Today, the people who attended residential schools call themselves survivors, to acknowledge the children who never returned to their families. More than 150,000 Indigenous children were taken from their families and forced to attend these schools beginning in 1883, and the last residential school did not finally close its doors until 1996. Orange Shirt Day began in 2013 as a result of residential school survivor Phyllis Jack Webstead discussing her experience when she arrived at a residential school in 1973 called St. Joseph's Mission in Williams Lake, BC. On her first day of school at the age of 6, she was wearing a new orange shirt with laces in the front that her grandmother had bought for her. When she got to the mission, they stripped her and took away her clothes, including her orange shirt. Phyllis's experience is used today to teach students about residential schools and their assimilation practices. The date of September 30th was chosen for the annual event because it is the time of year when Indigenous children were historically taken from their homes and sent to residential schools.
The immigration boom leading up to 1914 was one of the most important periods of Canadian population growth. Significant changes occurred in Canada after 1867 that made the prairie immigration boom possible. The construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway, a transcontinental railroad, made transportation and travel accessible and was a powerful symbol of unity in Canada. After many years of historic work, the CPR's Ribbons of Steel fulfilled a national dream. The Dominion Lands Act of 1872 offered settlers over the age of 21 160 acres for a $10 registration fee. This created free and fertile homesteads for settlers, allowing a thriving new economy to emerge and create prosperity for everyone.
While the settlers were enjoying making their homes in this new land, the Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, was deliberately starving thousands of Aboriginal people to clear a path for these white prairie settlements and the Canadian Pacific Railroad as part of his national dream. Author James Daschuk, a professor at the University of Regina, published a book in 2014 called Clearing the Plains that has won him many awards and prizes. This book took him 20 years to research and write, and he explains how my people were tragically affected by nature, disease, and the cultural genocide of the government all at the same time. First, the white fur traders infected us with diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza that we had no immunity to, and this wiped out huge segments of our population. Then the bison that we depended on for food nearly became extinct because of overhunting, which left our families hungry and desperate. When we called on the Prime Minister to help, we believed we would get help because he had signed treaties with us, saying he guaranteed we had food in times of famine and the ability to support our families in the thriving economy that was taking place in the white settlements. But instead of honoring those treaties, he ordered the Department of Indian Affairs in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, to withhold food until we moved to reserves far away from the path of the Canadian Pacific Railway, which was a key factor in the government expansion of Canada. When we had no choice to move to reserves because we were starving, we were trapped and were only allowed to leave with government permission. We could not farm or hunt because we had no land and no freedom. We were basically prisoners on a small piece of land. If we complained, we were given even less food from the government, and even the food we did get was rotting. One contaminated shipment of food triggered a mass outbreak of another deadly disease, tuberculosis. There are records of public statements of John A. MacDonald bragging that he was keeping the Indians on the verge of actual starvation to save government money. Author James Deschuk shares, "The uncomfortable truth is that modern Canada is founded upon ethnic cleansing and genocide that has only come to light in recent years." On January 11th, 2015, Canada celebrated Sir John A. Macdonald's 200th birthday as a Canadian hero for everything that he contributed to the foundation of Canada.
At the time of Confederation, only property-owning adult white males were allowed to vote in elections, which was common in most democratic countries at the time. But Dr. Emily Stowe, who was the first Canadian woman to practice medicine in Canada, started the women's suffrage movement. In 1918, Canadian women over age 21 were granted the right to vote, with the exception of Quebec, who granted women the right to vote in 1940. During the First World War, Second World War, and Korean War, thousands of Canadians served their country in the military or by serving on the home front in industry or agriculture. Canadians remember the sacrifices of our veterans and brave fallen soldiers, fallen in all wars up to the present day, in which Canadians took part each year on November 11th, Remembrance Day. Canadians wear the red poppy and observe a moment of silence at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month to honor the sacrifices of over 1 million brave men and women who have served and the 110,000 who have given their lives.
At the time of the First World War, First Nations were not asked to serve because they were not considered citizens of Canada. To serve in the Canadian Air Force or Canadian Navy, you had to be of pure European descent. But even though they were not asked to serve, First Nations people volunteered in the First World War, the Second World War, and the Korean War. First Nations people found it puzzling that the same government that had tried to take away their language in schools now wanted them to play a key and unique role in the war as code talkers. Code talkers would take important war information in English and then share it into Cree to another code talker far away, who would then translate it back into English for the military officers. This way, enemies listening could not understand the messages because they had no idea what language was being spoken. Here's an example.
The code word for a patrol plane was ga'agi, or crow in Navajo. A minesweeper was called cha'a, the Navajo word for beaver.
Code talkers were used in North America for decades, but they were not allowed to tell anyone about their important role. To this day, the Canadian government has not recognized the role that code talkers played in World War II. Between the two world wars, some Indian reserve land was taken back and sold to non-Indian veterans who wished to farm. Then after the Second World War, Indigenous soldiers found that when they returned home after fighting overseas for Canada, they had lost their status because the Indian Act specified that Indians absent from their reserve for 4 years were no longer Indians. But they also did not have the right to obtain other veteran benefits available to non-Aboriginal veterans due to Indian Act restrictions. It was so upsetting that they had been equal on the battlefield, but as soon as they returned, they were back under the same control as the government for almost every aspect of their lives.
By the 1960s, 1/3 of Canadians had origins that were neither British nor French and took pride in preserving their distinct culture in the Canadian fabric.
The federal government considered residential schools the most effective way to take control of Indians, but in 1951 the Indian Act was changed to give control of Indigenous children to the provinces. It was becoming obvious that the residential schools were too expensive and not working to assimilate the children, so the provinces had a different approach. They decided that a less expensive way to take children from their reserves and place them with non-Indigenous families. This is now called the 60s scoop, but actually started in the 1950s and continued on into the 1980s. Children who were in stable, loving families were visited by the government's social workers with no training on Indigenous culture. As an example, when they saw a family providing dried meat, fish, and berries for their children instead of a fridge and pantry of canned food, they said the children were not being taken care of properly, and the children were taken from their families and placed for adoption or in foster care with mostly white families across the country. Mothers who just gave birth reported being pressured by doctors and social workers to give up their children temporarily, but when they wanted to bring their children home, they were told it was too late. Brothers and sisters were separated and sent to different families. In Saskatchewan, we even had an adoption agency called AIM, which stood for Adopt Indian and Métis, that was run by the Saskatchewan government, and they would place ads in newspapers with pictures of children who had been taken. Many of these approximately 20,000 children experienced physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. They grew up not knowing their heritage, their families who loved and missed them, and many still struggle today.
Post-war Canada enjoyed record prosperity and material progress. The world's restrictive trading policies in the Depression era were opened up, and such treaties as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, now the World Trade Organization. The discovery of oil in Alberta in 1947 began Canada's modern energy industry. In 1951, for the first time, a majority of Canadians were able to afford adequate food, shelter, and clothing. Between 1945 and 1970, as Canada drew closer to the United States and other trading partners, the country enjoyed one of the strongest economies amongst industrialized nations. As social values changed over more than 50 years, Canada became a more flexible and open society. Many took advantage of expanding secondary and post-secondary educational opportunities, and a growing number of women entered the professional workforce. Today, Canadians enjoy one of the world's highest standards of living, maintained by the hard work of Canadians and by trade with other nations.
There are so many things that the government did in the Indian Act of 1876 to make it impossible for us to live our lives the way we wanted to, which continued for decades. They gave us each something called an Indian status number, and we were wards of the state, which meant we were like children of the government, and they controlled our lives until we became what they considered civilized. They tried to change everything about us. Growing up, I didn't learn any of this in school. I did grow up hearing elders in my community talk about residential schools and the troubles that they faced, but that was about it. When we started the Valentine Project, it was to bring awareness and a voice to my people. And what I found is that the history is not hidden anymore, but unless you really dig, it is hard to find. I am still learning myself, and I want Canada to know the real truth about First Nations history, because the only way we can change the future is to acknowledge the past. And we want to change the future.